All right. So reproduction and development. Obviously, reproduction is necessary for a species to stay alive, for the species to continue in the future. If species can't reproduce, can't survive, will become extinct. So there's two kind of forms of reproduction that we talk about. Asexual reproduction, which is when basically the offspring is just a copy of the parent. Okay? There's no variation or very little variation. Cloning, for example, produces identical copies. A single-celled bacteria just splits in two, okay, without any exchange of genetic information. That's asexual reproduction. The starfish here, growing from one arm into a whole new starfish, that's asexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction involves the mixing of genes from two different organisms, combining of chromosomes or genetic material. So most animals reproduce sexually. Plants can reproduce sexually, where a sex cell from one organism combines with a sex cell from another, and that produces the offspring.
What the heck is wrong with that baby?
It's a little chunky.
It looks like it's got a goiter or something.
Don't judge it, Kate. It's not very nice. I think it's quite cute myself.
Well, it's gonna change eventually.
Yeah. So when an egg cell and a sperm cell fertilize and combine, it forms the very first cell is called the zygote. A single cell, but it has the full number of chromosomes. And then it starts to divide from one cell into 2 and 4 and 8 and 16 and so forth. It eventually forms that hollow ball, then it indents, and eventually starts to grow into an embryo. It does this by dividing many, many times by mitosis. And the cells eventually start to take on certain roles. Some are starting to become nervous system cells. Some are becoming skin cells. That process is called differentiation. The cells are becoming different from each other. And again, even though all these cells have the exact same DNA, in some cells, certain genes are turned on and others are turned off. And that depends on the location of the cell. For example, our skin cells, in their skin cells, there's the information to produce saliva, right? The genes for producing saliva. Thank goodness they're not turned on in our skin cell. Otherwise, saliva would be coming out of our skin. That gene is turned off in our skin cells. In our mouth, that gene's turned on. So when we talk about reproductive systems, male versus female, a male reproductive system does two things. It produces testosterone, which is the male sex hormone that's produced in the testes. It also produces sperm cells, the male gamete, and delivers them to the female reproductive system during reproduction. The female reproductive system has ovaries, which are kind of the equivalent to the testes. They produce the female sex hormone, estrogen, and they produce gametes, female gametes, which are egg cells. In females, the egg cells are released about once every month or so, once every reproductive cycle. They travel through the oviduct, and here's where they can be fertilized. If sperm are present, they can fertilize the cell in the oviduct, and then it can start to divide and turn into an embryo. So the female reproductive cycle works based on these hormones, estrogen and progesterone and other hormones. And those levels change throughout the cycle. And as they change, they prompt certain things to happen. They cause ovulation to happen, which is when the ovary releases the egg cell into the oviduct. They cause the lining of the uterus to thicken, preparing for an embryo to implant. And eventually, if there is no embryo, menstruation happens and the lining is shed in the menstrual period. So all these things are kind of synchronized because of these hormones. If a embryo is there and present, it attaches to the wall of the uterus, and that's where the placenta begins to form. The placenta is, again, where blood vessels from the mother and the fetus are right next to each other. They don't connect, but they're next to each other. so that materials can diffuse back and forth. Oxygen from the mother's blood can diffuse into the blood of the fetus. Nutrients, vitamins can diffuse from the mother's blood into the fetus. At the same time, waste products from the fetus's blood diffuse into the mother's blood, and then she can get rid of it. She can exhale the carbon dioxide. She can get rid of the waste by her kidneys. So the placenta is really important. If the placenta isn't functioning properly, there's a problem with it, it could jeopardize the fetus because it needs that placenta in order to obtain everything it needs. The embryo is also surrounded in that sac, the amniotic sac, which is filled with fluid. It cushions the embryo, the fetus, as it's growing inside of the uterus. Okay, that's it for reproduction.